He paid $1 for the land. He didn't know the land came with her, or that she'd cost him everything he thought he knew about himself. The auctioneer's voice was barely above a bored mumble when Eli Casson raised his hand. $1. That was all it took. One crumpled, sun-faded dollar bill pulled from the front pocket of his worn denim jacket, held up like it was worth 1,000. The crowd at the Harlow County property auction had gone quiet, not the respectful kind of quiet, but the kind that happens when people think someone's made a fool of themselves in public. Eli could feel their stares pressing against the back of his neck like a branding iron hovering just before contact. He didn't flinch. He'd learned a long time ago that the thing that looks like a mistake is sometimes the only honest move left on the board. "Sold," the auctioneer said flatly, "to the gentleman in the back, $1 for the Mallory Creek property." He paused, then added with a dry smirk that got a low ripple of laughter from the assembled ranchers and land agents, "Good luck with that." Eli didn't smile back. He took his paperwork, tucked it into his jacket, and walked out into the blinding New Mexico afternoon without looking at a single person. His boots scraped the dry wooden steps of the county hall, and the hot August air hit him like a wall. He stood there for a moment, squinting against the white sky, letting the reality settle over him the way dust settles after a stampede, slowly, inevitably, coating everything. He owned a ranch. A broken-down, bank-foreclosed, reputation-destroyed ranch that 3 separate buyers had walked away from in the last 6 months. A place the whole county whispered about in that particular way people whisper about things they're afraid of and don't fully understand. Mallory Creek, named for the family that had worked it for 2 generations before the drought and the debt, and the tragedy had hollowed it out like a rotted tree. People said the water had gone bad. People said the fences were cursed. People said a lot of things in a small county, with not enough to talk about. What people didn't say, what not a single person at that auction had bothered to mention, was that the property wasn't empty. Eli drove the hour-long road out to Mallory Creek with the windows down and the radio off. He needed the silence, needed to think through what exactly he was doing with the last of his savings, the last of his father's inheritance, the last real chance he had at building something that was his. He was 32 years old. He'd spent the last decade doing other people's ranch work, mending other men's fences, tending other men's cattle, sleeping in other men's bunkhouses. He had a strong back, a quiet mouth, and a talent for fixing things other people had given up on. Those had been enough to survive. They hadn't been enough to live. The road to Mallory Creek was unpaved for the last 4 miles, a red dirt track that wound through scrubland and juniper with the easy confidence of something that had been there forever and planned to stay. The truck rattled through it like an old man walking too fast, protesting but moving. Eli gripped the wheel and watched the landscape change, the scrub giving way to longer grass, the flat plain rolling gently upward toward a ridge of amber rock that caught the afternoon light like hammered copper. He saw the ranch house before he expected to. It sat in a shallow depression between 2 low hills, half hidden by a stand of cottonwood trees that must have been drinking from the creek bed even in the drought. It was bigger than he'd anticipated, a proper 2-story adobe structure, walls thick as a man's forearm, with a wide covered porch wrapping around the front and side. The roof had lost some tiles. One of the porch supports leaned at an angle that would have worried a less practiced eye. The windows facing him were dark, but the structure itself was solid. Whatever had beaten this place, it hadn't been time or weather. He parked the truck at the edge of what had once been a proper gravel drive, now mostly overtaken by tough yellow grass, and stepped out. The heat was different here, still fierce, but cut by something, a faint coolness that spoke of moving water nearby. The creek, he figured. Still alive then, despite what people said. He stood and looked at the house for a long moment, doing the mental inventory that had become second nature to him, cataloging damage and potential with equal calm. Then the front door opened, and everything he thought he knew about what came next dissolved completely. She stood in the doorway like she'd been expecting him, which, As it turned out, she had arms crossed over her chest, one shoulder leaning against the doorframe with a studied casualness that didn't quite cover the tension in her jaw. She was somewhere in her mid-twenties, tall for a woman, with the kind of lean, work-hardened build that came from years of actual labor rather than any deliberate effort at it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose braid that had clearly been tighter that morning and lost the argument with the day. She wore a faded chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, work pants, and boots that had more miles on them than his truck. Her eyes were the color of creek water over flat rock, a complicated gray-green that shifted depending on how the light hit them. At that moment, in the full blaze of the afternoon sun, they were mostly storm. "You're the one who bought it," she said, not a question. "I am," Eli said, stopping about 10 feet from the porch. "For $1. That's what it sold for." She looked at him the way people look at things that don't quite make sense, not hostile, exactly, but not welcoming either, like something requiring evaluation. "The county auctioneer called ahead," she said. "Figured you'd want to know." Eli processed that. "He called you?" "I've been living here," she said simply, "for about 8 months. After the bank foreclosed, they didn't bother sending anyone out to check the property. I needed a place." She paused, and something shifted in her expression, not apology exactly, more like the kind of honesty that doesn't ask for forgiveness but doesn't hide either. "I've been maintaining it. The fences in the south pasture, the water line to the barn, the roof on the east side." She nodded upward, indicating the house. "I fixed the structural crack in the north wall myself." Eli was quiet for a moment. The afternoon hummed around them, insects and heat and distance. A hawk turned in a slow circle over the far hill. "What's your name?" he asked. She studied him for another beat. Then, "Wren." "Just Wren." "For now," she said. He looked at the house, looked at her, looked at the land spreading out behind them. The damaged, complicated, improbably beautiful land that he just paid $1 for. "Well, Wren," he said, pulling out his paperwork and holding it up briefly, not to prove a point but just to establish the plain facts between them, "I own this property now, but it sounds like you know it a lot better than I do." He tucked the papers back in. "So here's what I'm thinking. You tell me everything you know. I'll listen, and we figure out what comes next." She looked at him for a long moment. The storm in her eyes shifted, becoming something harder to name. "You're not going to try to throw me out," she said. "Not today," he said. And because he was a man who meant the things he said, he added, "Not if there's no reason to." The silence between them was long and oddly textured, not empty but full of unsaid things, like a room where someone has just finished speaking and the echo hasn't settled. Then Wren uncrossed her arms, pushed off the doorframe, and stepped back into the house. "Come in then," she said. "I'll put coffee on." The inside of the house was a revelation. Eli had expected neglect, peeling walls, scattered debris, the particular desolation of an abandoned place. What he found instead was something that had been very carefully lived in. The main room was spare but intentional. A salvaged wood table with mismatched chairs, a bookshelf made from old crates stacked with battered paperbacks, and a few thicker volumes on livestock and land management, a wood stove that looked recently maintained. The floor was swept clean. There was a ceramic bowl on the windowsill with a single cutting of some desert herb growing in it, roots visible through the cracked glaze. The walls were bare adobe, except for one, the east wall, where someone had tacked up a hand-drawn map of the property in pencil and charcoal, surprisingly detailed, marking fences and water lines and grazing quadrants with the kind of practiced notation that came from knowing what you were looking at. He stood in front of that map while Wren moved in the kitchen, and he studied it. She'd marked 4 sections of fence as needing replacement and 2 as done. The creek's path was traced in blue pen, different from the original survey lines. She'd added annotations in small, precise handwriting that he had to lean in to read. "Water here in May and soil improves 200 m north," and in one corner of the south pasture, just the single word "wait." "You made this," he said. "After my second month here," she called from the kitchen. "I needed to understand what I was working with." "What does wait mean?" He pointed to the south pasture notation, though she couldn't see him. There was a pause, the sound of a coffee pot being set down. Then, "It means there's something good there if the water table recovers. Don't rush it." Eli straightened up. He could hear the quiet authority in her voice, the way someone sounds when they're telling you something they learned the hard way and are used to not being believed. He'd sounded that way himself sometimes. He recognized it. She came back with 2 mugs, thick ceramic, clearly from the house's original stock, and set one on the table near him without ceremony. She took her own to the chair nearest the window and sat, pulling one knee up, watching him with that same evaluating look. "Sit down," she said. "You're making me tense, standing there like you're about to inspect the walls." "I was inspecting the walls," he said honestly, and sat down across the table from her. That surprised a short sound out of her, almost a laugh. Not quite, but close. He asked questions, she answered them. Not all of them, not immediately. Wren had a way of deciding which questions earned an answer and which ones got redirected, not evasively but with the precision of someone who'd learned the difference between what was relevant and what was just noise. But when the questions were relevant, she was thorough. She'd been here 8 months. She'd found the property vacant 6 weeks after the bank took it, had contacted the county to request temporary occupancy while it sat in foreclosure limbo, and had received what she described as a noncommittal response that she'd interpreted as tacit permission. She'd been fixing what she could, learning what she didn't know, and filing quiet mental inventory of what the ranch would need to become viable again. "The well is good," she told him, fingers wrapped around her mug, looking out the window at the shifting afternoon light. "That's the most important thing. Whatever people say about Mallory Creek, the water is good. The previous owners overworked the north pasture and let the south sit idle. The cattle operation failed because they ignored the land's own pattern." "You studied agriculture?" Eli asked. A brief hesitation. "I studied a lot of things." She turned her mug in her hands. "And I grew up on a working ranch before." He waited to see if before would explain itself. It didn't. "Where was that?" he asked. Her eyes came back to his, those gray-green depths that had steadied since they'd come inside. The storm quieted somewhat but not gone. "East of here," she said. "A long time ago." He could have pressed. He was a man who respected the shape of a conversation, though, the way you respect the shape of a fence line. You follow it where it goes. You don't cut across it just because you're impatient to get to the other side. "All right," he said, and they talked about fences instead. By the time the light outside turned orange and the shadows stretched long across the red dirt, they had covered the south pasture water table, the structural repairs needed on the barn, the condition of the cattle chutes, and the question of whether the creek's seasonal variation made irrigation feasible for a kitchen garden. They'd talked for 3 hours. Eli's coffee had gone cold and he'd drunk it anyway, because he was too interested in what she was saying to pause for things like temperature. Wren had moved over the course of the afternoon, from the chair by the window to the floor beside the crate bookshelf, back propped against the wall, one arm resting on her drawn-up knee. She talked about the land with a fluency that was almost physical, like a language her body knew as well as her mind. Her hands moved when she described the pasture grades. She tilted her head when she was working through a problem. Twice she got up to point at something on her wall map, and once she went outside briefly and came back with a handful of soil from the south bed, rubbing it between her fingers to show him the composition. "This," she said, holding out her hand toward him, the dark soil in her palm, "this is what people don't understand about this place. They look at it and they see the damage. They don't look underneath." Eli looked at the soil in her palm. Then he looked up at her face, at the certainty there, the quiet passion that had bled through her careful reserve somewhere in the last 3 hours without her seeming to notice. The evening light was doing complicated things to her expression, catching the angles differently. She was, he realized with the particular clarity that comes when you stop being guarded and start actually paying attention, remarkably striking. Not in a polished way, but in the way of something shaped by weather and use. The way an old tool is beautiful because every mark on it means something. He dropped his gaze back to the soil. What do you want to grow? She looked at him for a moment as if the question meant something she hadn't expected. Everything, she said. Then softer, I want to grow everything. That night Eli slept in his truck. Not because there weren't rooms. The house had 4 bedrooms on its second floor, and Wren occupied the one at the back end of the hall, the one that caught the cross breeze and had a view of the creek. There were 3 other rooms, 2 of which she kept clear and serviceable. She'd offered him one without hesitation, matter of fact, the way she did most things. But he'd said no, he'd take the truck, and she'd given him the look again, the evaluating one, and then nodded once and gone inside. He lay in the cab with the seat pushed back and the window cracked, listening to the ranch settle into its night sounds. The crickets were loud here, and once he heard what he thought was a coyote at the distance, and once something moved in the cottonwoods near the creek that he decided not to identify. The sky was remarkable, no light pollution out here, just the full architecture of stars laid out overhead with the casual extravagance of something that doesn't know it's being watched. He thought about the map on the wall, the precise small handwriting, the single word wait in the south pasture. He thought about the way she'd said everything, that soft particular emphasis that had the quality of a secret not quite kept. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what before meant. He didn't know why she was here alone on a broken-down ranch in the middle of nowhere, or what she was running from, or running toward, or neither, or both. What he knew was that he'd bought this land on instinct, on the bone-deep certainty that something real was buried here under the damage and the rumors, and that the land was not what he'd expected. Neither was she. He pulled his jacket tighter and watched the stars, and the long, quiet dark of Mallory Creek settled around him like something learning his shape. The first week was work. That was the thing about a damaged property. It didn't give you time to be uncertain or philosophical. The south fence line needed 3 full days just to assess and another 2 to begin repairs. The barn roof required shoring before the weather turned. The water line to the north trough had a hairline crack that would become a rupture by October if it wasn't addressed. Eli worked from before sunrise to well past it, and he discovered almost immediately that Wren kept the same hours. She didn't ask to help. She just arrived alongside him at whatever the next task was, wearing her work clothes and her practical expression, and the help was implied in the showing up. He didn't waste energy on courtesy that would slow them down. They worked in a companionable, largely wordless efficiency that surprised him in its naturalness. The way 2 people sometimes fall into a shared physical rhythm without negotiation, each moving to fill the space the other leaves, like water finding its level. She was strong. He'd clocked that in the first hour, not in a conspicuous way but in the way of someone who has been using their body as a tool for years, economical with effort, precise in placement, the kind of strength that doesn't advertise itself because it's never needed to. She could swing a post hammer with the fluid authority of long practice. She knew how to read a fence line for tension the way you read a sentence for meaning, quickly, by feel, catching the problems before they announced themselves. "Where'd you learn to fence?" he asked on the 3rd morning, watching her drive a post with a rhythm that was almost musical. She didn't break the rhythm. "Same place I learned everything," she said, "watching then doing." "Your family's ranch." Oh. He waited. The post hammer rang against the metal cap. 3 more strikes and she stopped, tested the post with both hands, gave a single satisfied nod. "My father built his operation from nothing," she said then, not looking at him, moving to reset the tool for the next position. "He used to say the land doesn't lie to you. People lie. Weather lies, markets lie. The land just tells you what's true." She paused, looking at the fence line. I believed him. "What happened to the ranch?" "A beat. He died. My stepmother sold it inside of a year. She said it without visible emotion, the flat factual tone of someone who has held that particular weight so many times it no longer requires expression. 600 acres of deep grass and good water. Gone. I'm sorry, Eli said. She looked at him then briefly, something crossing her face that was quickly resolved. Don't be, she said. It's why I'm good at recognizing land worth saving. She said it without any particular weight, but it landed heavily. He thought of his own dollar, his own instinct, his own need to build something that couldn't be taken. He thought of how two lost people can sometimes recognize each other across a distance that shouldn't allow for it. He didn't say any of that. He picked up his end of the wire spool and they moved to the next post. The evenings were different. The work burned off something that the evenings didn't have: the ease of shared purpose, the uncomplicated grammar of physical labor. In the evenings, they sat on the porch while the sky turned colors that had no proper name, and they talked, and the talking was more careful. Not false. Wren was constitutionally incapable of falseness, as far as Eli could tell, but considered. Chosen. She made food that was simple and surprisingly good, using what was in the dry goods she'd stockpiled and what she grew in a small kitchen bed behind the house. He'd brought provisions from town on his second day, more than he needed, partly practical and partly instinct, the same instinct that made him put coffee on before he called anyone for help. She noticed, said nothing. But the third morning there was a pan of cornbread on the table when he came in from checking the water line, golden and still warm, and that said enough. He learned her in pieces. She read voraciously and eclectically. The battered paperbacks were mysteries and classic literature, and one extremely technical volume on soil chemistry that she could apparently quote from memory. She talked to the ranch's one remaining horse, a senior bay mare named Concordia, with a low-voiced affection she didn't deploy elsewhere. She had very specific opinions about fencing methodology that she would defend at length with a combination of calm logic and absolute stubbornness that was both maddening and oddly compelling. She woke before him every morning and could be found at dawn standing near the creek with her coffee, watching the light come, doing the thing he'd noticed in that first afternoon, just looking, like the land was saying something she needed to hear. He didn't interrupt those mornings. He made his own coffee and watched from the porch, and if she knew he was there, she didn't show it. But once, on the fifth morning, she turned before going back inside and looked at him on the porch with a long, unreadable expression that lasted just a breath too long before she turned away, and he felt the oddest sensation, a kind of warm dislocation, as if the ground under him had shifted a quarter-inch in a direction he didn't have a name for. On the eighth day, he found her in the barn at midnight. He'd woken at 2 in the morning with the specific alertness that comes when something has changed in the ambient sound of a place you've learned, and what he heard was Concordia, distressed in the barn, not screaming but the low, unhappy vocalization that horses make when they're frightened or in pain. He pulled his boots on without thinking and crossed the dark yard with a flashlight, and pushed the barn door open to find Wren already there. She was crouched in the straw at Concordia's head, one hand on the horse's neck, talking quietly. The mare was down, not cast, but lying voluntarily, shivering in a way that wasn't about temperature. Wren looked up when he came in, and the lantern she'd hung from the rafter caught her face. No panic in it, just focus, and something underneath that was worry she was working to keep out of her hands and voice so the horse wouldn't feel it. Colic, she said. Not severe yet. I've been walking her, but she wanted to go down 20 minutes ago. I let her. You've managed colic before, he said, not a question. Yes, she looked back at the horse. I need you to take the other side, talk to her. He went to Concordia's other side without question, settling into the straw, putting his hand on the mare's neck the way Wren's was, feeling the tension in the animal and the shivering that was pain and confusion and fear. He talked. He didn't have prepared things to say to frighten horses. He just said what was true in the tone that mattered, low and certain and unhurried. You're okay. You're going to be okay. We're right here. We're not going anywhere. Across the length of the horse in the amber lantern light, he could see Wren. She was murmuring something he couldn't hear. Her braid had come fully loose now, dark hair falling around her shoulder. Her hand moved in slow circles on the mare's neck. There was something in her face, unguarded in a way she wasn't usually, softened by her worry for the animal and the lateness and the particular intimacy of a small crisis weathered in the dark, that made him aware of her with a sudden sharpness that was different from the way he'd been aware of her before. Not that he'd been unaware of her before. He was self-honest enough to acknowledge that. She was a striking person, and he had working eyes and a functioning heart. But he'd been keeping that awareness at a management distance, the way you bank a fire you don't need yet, carefully, deliberately, out of respect for the complexity of their situation and the newness of whatever it was they were building here. This moment, though, the darkness and the animal between them and her face, uncovered by the usual reserve, management distance, felt suddenly arbitrary. He looked away, back at the horse. They stayed for 2 hours. Concordia worked through it slowly, the way horses do, with patience and suffering and periodic terrible gratitude for the hands on her neck. When the shivering finally eased and the mare's breathing settled, they both sat back, and Wren let out a long breath, and the sound of it in the quiet barn was the most genuinely vulnerable thing she'd allowed him to witness. "She'll be okay," he said. "Yes." Wren was quiet, looking at Concordia's slowly steadying sides. "She's been through worse." A pause. "So have I." He didn't fill that silence. He let it be what it was. After a moment, she looked at him, across the mare, across the straw and lantern light, and the look was long and complicated and honest in a way that was different from her usual measured honesty. Like something had been shown that didn't usually show. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for coming." "I heard her," he said, meaning of course. She held his gaze a moment longer, long enough that he felt it, and then looked back at the horse. "We should take turns sleeping," she said, "in case she goes down again." "I'll take first watch," he said. And Wren, who never accepted help without some form of negotiation, just nodded and tucked herself against the barn wall with her jacket pulled over her shoulders and closed her eyes, and he sat in the lantern light next to Concordia and kept watch over both of them. 3 weeks in, a man named Garrett Cole came to the property. He drove a clean black truck up the red dirt road like he owned it, which Eli understood immediately from the way Wren's entire body changed when she saw the truck from the porch. He was at least partially convinced he did. Not legally, but in some other way, some older and less codified way that Eli recognized from experience as the worst kind of ownership, the kind that lives in someone's head. Cole was 40, broad-shouldered, sun-leathered, with the easy confidence of a man who'd never seriously been told no. He ran the largest cattle operation in Harlow County. Eli knew the name, had worked adjacent to his operation years ago, had formed quiet opinions. He stepped out of his truck, surveyed the property with the proprietary squint of someone assessing an investment, and then saw Eli standing with Wren on the porch, and allowed a single beat of recalibration before he smiled. "Casson," he said, coming forward with his hand extended, "heard you bought this place." "Cole," Eli said, shaking at once, "what brings you out here?" Cole's eyes slid to Wren, and something passed through them that Eli filed and kept. "Just being neighborly," he said, "and wanted to check on Wren here, seeing as how she's been on her own out here since the winter." He smiled at her, a wide, practiced smile that didn't reach the same altitude as his eyes. "You've been hard to reach." "I've been busy," Wren said. Her voice was level, perfectly carefully level. "You know you could have come to us," Cole said, and the us was weighted. "My operations always had room for." "I'm good here," she said, still level, still careful. Cole looked between them, making a small recalculation that he tried to hide behind the smile. "Well," he said, "you need anything, supplies, hands for the work, whatever, my door's open." He held Eli's gaze a moment longer than necessary. "Both of yours." He left the same way he arrived, clean truck, easy confidence, the practiced departure of a man who assumes he'll be thought about after he's gone. The silence after the truck disappeared down the red dirt road was different from their usual silences. This one had weight in it. "He has a claim on you," Eli said finally. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't an accusation either. Wren was quiet for a moment, her arms crossed, watching the dust the truck had raised settle slowly back to earth. "He thinks he does," she said carefully. "He helped me after my father died, gave me work on his operation for a while." She paused. "He decided that meant something more than it did." "Did you?" "No," she said flatly. Then, after a beat, "He was kind to me when I needed kindness. I let him believe things I shouldn't have let him believe because I needed somewhere to land." She turned and looked at him squarely, the direct, undefended honesty that was her particular form of courage. "I'm not proud of it. It wasn't fair to him. But the thing he thought was between us isn't what I—" She stopped. The silence stretched. "Isn't what you," Eli said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw worked once, like she was deciding something. "Isn't what I am," she said finally, and then she went inside. Eli stood on the porch for a long time after, looking at the land, turning those words over in the way you turn soil before planting carefully to see what's underneath. "Isn't what I am." He thought about what that meant. He thought about the specific quality of her solitude. Not lonely, exactly, but self-contained in a way that had the weight of someone who'd learned to need less from the world because what they actually needed wasn't readily offered. He thought about the way she talked about the ranch and the land and the things that could grow here with the particular reverence of someone who had found, in a place that had been abandoned and misunderstood, something that felt like recognition. He thought about himself at 23, standing in a different county in a different state, in a different man's bunkhouse, understanding something about who he was that he'd known for years but hadn't said to anyone yet. The specific weight of that. The specific relief when he finally did. He understood, he thought, the shape of what Wren hadn't said. He didn't say any of this to her, but something changed in him, some internal adjustment that was quiet and fundamental, a shift in how he held the space between them. The kitchen garden became their evening ritual. It had started practically. The soil behind the house was good, the well water was reliable, and Eli had no particular opinion about what got planted as long as something did. But Wren had opinions, careful, considered, passionate opinions about companion planting and soil amendment, and which varieties had the best cold tolerance for the elevation, and the garden became the place where those opinions lived. She talked differently in the garden. The reserve that she carried elsewhere loosened here, in the dirt, among things growing and almost growing and needing to grow. Her hands were always in the soil, testing, checking, adjusting. She'd come back to the porch afterward with her knuckles dark and her boots dusty, and a kind of light in her face that was different from anything she showed the rest of the day. He started helping without being asked, carrying water, laying the irrigation lines she'd sketched out on a piece of paper with the same precision she'd drawn the land map, building the raised beds from salvaged lumber. She directed and he executed, and twice she corrected him, firmly, no apology, and he accepted the corrections because they were right, and he could feel her notice that he accepted them. One evening in the fourth week, they were both on their knees in the garden in the last hour of light, working close because the space between the beds was narrow, and she was showing him how to test seedling health by the color and texture of the first true leaves. She was close, closer than the work required, he thought, though maybe not closer than the light required, since the sun was almost gone and they were both leaning toward the small plants to see them. Her shoulder was a few inches from his. He could smell the work of the day on her, soil and sun, and the faint sage-like herb she kept on the windowsill and apparently used in some way he hadn't identified. She said something about leaf color and he turned to respond, and realized that in the turn she'd turned too, responding to the same impulse, and their faces were suddenly closer than either of them had planned, not touching, not quite, but in the particular geography of close where you feel another person's warmth before you feel the air. Neither of them moved. It was a long, still moment, the kind where the world does that specific thing where it seems to narrow down to a single point and everything else goes quiet. Her eyes were very near, that gray-green that he'd been cataloging for weeks, and in them he could see something he recognized. The thing a person looks like when they want something and are afraid of what the wanting means and are, in this moment, too tired of being afraid to hide it perfectly. He thought later that he could have said something then. He thought later that the moment probably asked for something, some word or gesture that would have acknowledged what was happening between them and given it room to exist. What he did instead was take a slow breath, look back at the seedlings and say, "The color's good." And Ren said after a beat, "Yes, a breath, it's good." And they finished the work in near silence and came back to the porch and sat with their cooled evening coffee, and neither of them said anything about what hadn't happened. But it was there. It was definitely there. As real as the good soil, as present as the water running in the creek, as undeniable as the land that knew what it was even before it had been told. The weather broke in late September without warning. The sky had been heavy since morning, not the clear light through haze of ordinary autumn, but a specific dark bronze that old ranch hands knew to respect. And by afternoon, the wind had picked up with serious intention, bending the tall grass flat and lifting dust from the dry patches in long red veils. Eli had spent the morning moving supplies from the barn's exposed linta to the main building, working fast, and he'd seen Ren doing the same with the garden, putting up the frames and covers she'd built for exactly this, with the quick efficiency of someone who has taken a crop loss before and will not take another. The rain came at 4:30, not gently. It came the way rain comes in the high desert, in complete seriousness, without prologue, as if it had been waiting for the exact right moment to stop not raining and start raining with its entire self. Eli was crossing from the barn when it hit, and he was drenched in the time it took to run the 30 yards to the porch. He came in through the front door shaking water from his hair and found Ren already there. She'd apparently made it in 30 seconds earlier, standing in the main room with a towel around her shoulders, her wet braid dark against her back, watching the rain come down through the window with an expression that wasn't alarmed but wasn't entirely calm either. "How's the south fence?" she said without turning. "Solid," he said. "We redid those posts last week." "The east corner of the garden bed." "Covered, I checked it at noon." She let out a breath. Then she turned and looked at him dripping on the floor, and something ran through her face, a quick flash of something warm that was gone almost before it appeared, replaced by her ordinary composure. "You're a mess," she said. "You're also wet," he pointed out. She looked down at herself. A beat of silence. Then she laughed, a real one, the kind that happened quickly and apparently surprised her, because she put one hand up like she was going to cover it and then didn't, and the laugh was brief and full-throated and entirely unguarded. He'd heard her laugh before, small, controlled things, exhaled through the nose mostly. This was different. This was the laugh she had when she wasn't being careful, and it was one of the most disarming things he'd ever heard. He stood there, dripping, and watched her laugh, and felt something shift in his chest that was not subtle. The storm settled in and didn't move. By evening it was clear it intended to stay the night, which meant no going out, no evening rounds, just the house and the rain and the two of them. They cooked together for the first time properly, not one cooking and the other nearby, but both of them in the kitchen simultaneously, with the particular negotiation of bodies in a small space, stepping around each other, passing things without being asked, building a meal with the same unspoken coordination they developed on the fence line. She made chili stew from dried and canned provisions, with the dried herb from her windowsill pot added at the end. He made cornbread from her recipe, which she directed from across the kitchen with occasional skepticism about his technique that was so dry it could have doubled for sand. The stove warmed the room. The rain beat the windows and the roof with persistence. The lantern light made everything amber and close. They ate at the table they'd been eating at separately for nearly a month, but something about the storm made it different. The shared containment of it, the enforced proximity, the elemental emphasis of weather that says, "You are here in this shelter, and the world outside is the world outside." They talked. They talked the way they hadn't quite talked before, past the practical, past the provisional, into something more open. He told her about his father, about the years of itinerant ranch work, about the specific loneliness of being good at something that was never quite yours. She told him about growing up on her father's ranch, the early mornings and the animal sounds and the particular love she'd had for the land that felt, she said, like the only thing that had ever been exactly right. "It was the only place I knew how to be myself," she said. She was looking at the stew spoon in her hand, turning it slowly. "Everywhere else I felt like I was wearing the wrong size of something, too big or too small, but on the land," she stopped. "You fit," he said. She looked up. "Yes," she said, and then after a pause, "How did you know that?" "Because that's what I was looking for when I bought this place," he said. "Something I could fit." The rain said everything outside that they didn't say in. It said it loudly, reliably, without pause. She put down the spoon, looked at him with the directness that was her truest characteristic, undeflected, clear-eyed, the gray-green steady. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You don't usually ask permission," he said. "This is different." She was quiet a moment, choosing. "When Garrett was here and I said," she stopped, reformatted, "the thing I said about what I am." "I remember," he said carefully. "You didn't ask," she said. "You just—" She made a small gesture with one hand, the shape of something being set aside without judgment. "You let it be what it was." "It wasn't mine to ask about," he said. "Most people make it theirs to ask about," she said. There was something in her voice, not bitterness, but the memory of things that had their cost. "Most people make it a whole thing they need explained and defended and put in a category they recognize." She looked at her hands on the table. "I've had a lot of those conversations. They're exhausting." He was quiet, giving her the space she was taking, the space she needed. "I've never," she started again. The rain outside intensified briefly, a curtain of sound, and then settled. "I've never been somewhere long enough to not have those conversations, to just—" her jaw worked. "Just be." "You're being," he said. "You've been being this whole time. I don't need to categorize it." She looked at him. The lantern light caught her eyes, made them impossibly complicated. He could see her processing, not the disbelief of someone being told something false, but the specific difficulty of someone being told something true when they've spent a long time expecting the opposite. "Why not?" she said quietly. "Because it's not mine," he said. "Because you're a person working land and building something real and you already know who you are. The category is yours." The silence was long. The storm outside was the whole world. She stopped, tried again, and her voice was quieter, carrying something he could hear had weight. "I'm not sure I actually know," she said. "Not completely, who I am. I thought I did, before my father died and everything," she broke off. "I've been figuring it out here on this land, quietly." She looked at him. "That's partly why I stayed. It's quiet enough here to hear yourself think." "Have you been hearing yourself?" he asked. Something moved in her face, a complicated tenderness that was wholly unreserved, wholly genuine, wholly undefended. "More lately," she said. "Yes." They sat by the wood stove after dinner, the rain still going, and she told him the rest. Not all of it. Some things take longer than one storm to find their voice, but the bones of it. The ranch, her father, the stepmother and the sale, Garrett's operation and the year she'd spent there and what it had taught her about what she didn't want, even when she hadn't quite understood yet what she did. The winter alone at Mallory Creek, learning the land and being learned by it, and the peculiar piece of that, an alone that was different from loneliness because it had been chosen. He listened. He did not perform listening. he actually listened. The way he listened to fence lines and soil and animals, with his whole attention, and without requiring anything of what he heard except that it be true. When she finished, he told her things too. About who he was, about the years it had taken to be clear about it without apology, about the specific difficulty and eventual relief of that clarity. He told it simply, without drama, the way you tell something important that has long since settled. She listened to him with her full attention, and he could see something in her face unlock: recognition, understanding, the particular ease that comes when you tell something true and are met with something true in return. "So you know," she said when he'd finished. "I know," he said, "what it's like to be the wrong size everywhere, except the one right place." "Yes," he said. The fire crackled. The rain said its thing against the windows. Concordia in the barn was presumably fine and sleeping. The land outside was drinking the water it had been waiting months for. "I'm glad you bought this place," she said, so quietly he almost didn't catch it. "For $1, he said. And there it was again, the laugh, the real one, warm and sudden and entirely herself. "For $1, she agreed. October came cold, and the work changed character. The urgent crisis repairs were done, fence lines secured, barn reinforced, water systems reliable. What remained was the slower, more considered work of improvement rather than rescue, the kind of work that required decisions about the future rather than reactions to the present. Eli made those decisions carefully, and increasingly he made them in conversation with Wren, because her knowledge of the land was deep and her judgment was sound, and because he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge this, he wanted the conversation. What he was less honest about for a while was what kind of conversation he wanted. The something that had been building between them since that first afternoon had not gone away after the storm. If anything, the storm had clarified it, the way a lens sharpens when you adjust the focus, bringing something that was always there into definition. He was aware of her with a specificity that had its own vocabulary. The particular way the morning light caught her in her spot by the creek, the sound of her voice when she was showing him something she found beautiful about the land, the way she went still when she was thinking, the way she came alive when she was planting. He was aware that this awareness was a complication he hadn't budgeted for. He was also aware that she was going through something of her own, a process of self-definition that was both brave and fragile, that needed space and patience, and absolutely not the added complexity of someone who lived 40 yards away developing feelings about her. She'd come here to figure herself out in the quiet. He was not quiet. He was, increasingly, the opposite of quiet in her vicinity, regardless of how little he actually said. So he managed it. He banked the fire carefully, as he'd been doing since the beginning. He stayed in the practical and the friendly. He gave her space when she seemed to need it and showed up when the work required and tried, with moderate success, not to notice too precisely the way her shoulder moved when she was mending something, or the sound of her laughing at Concordia's opinions, or the look on her face in the garden in the last of the evening light. Moderate success. Garrett Cole came back in the 3rd week of October. This time Eli wasn't there when he arrived. He'd driven into town for supplies and came back to find Cole's black truck in the drive, and Cole on the porch, and Wren standing with her arms crossed, and her jaw set with the particular quality of someone being careful about every single word they're saying. Eli pulled up slow and got out and read the scene with a rancher's practiced eye for what's actually happening under the surface of things. "Casson," Cole said, and the ease was still in his voice, but it had an edge now, a precision to it that hadn't been there before. "Good trip to town." "Fine trip," Eli said, setting the tailgate down to start unloading. "You staying for anything in particular?" Cole's eyes went to Wren, then back to Eli, and did the calculation that he'd been building toward probably since his first visit, the assessment of what exactly was happening at Mallory Creek, what this man's presence on this property meant, what had changed. "There's a land opportunity coming up," Cole said. "Counties releasing the parcels to the north. Good water access. Thought you might be interested in a partnership." "I'll look into it," Eli said neutrally, continuing to unload. "Worth discussing in detail," Cole said. "Why don't you come up to my place, say Sunday, both of you?" And the way he said both of you had a specific weight to it, inclusive on the surface, claiming underneath. "Maybe," Eli said. After Cole had gone, Wren came and helped him unload the truck without comment. They worked side by side in the gathering cold, carrying things to the larder and the barn and the house. When it was done, they stood in the kitchen unpacking the dry goods, and Eli said carefully, "You don't have to go to his place." "I know I don't," she said. She was quiet a moment, putting tinned goods on the shelf with more care than tinned goods required. "He thinks he understands the situation here." "What situation does he think he understands?" She paused with a tin in her hand, looked at the shelf. "He thinks I'm a breath. He thinks I'm here because of you in a specific way." She put the tin down. "He thinks it's simpler than it is." "Is it simple?" Eli said. He kept his voice level because the question deserved level. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, it was measured. "No." They finished unpacking. Neither of them said anything else. But that night he couldn't sleep, and he lay in his room. He'd moved from the truck to the second bedroom 2 weeks after arrival, with no ceremony and no discussion, because the nights had turned cold and it was a practical decision, and stared at the ceiling and was honest with himself in the way you can be when there's nobody watching. It wasn't simple. She was right about that. It was the opposite of simple. It was the most complicated thing he'd let himself feel in a very long time, and it was complicated specifically because she was in a place of working things out that was hers and hers alone, and what he felt had no claim on any part of that, and he needed to be very clear with himself about the boundary between what was hers to figure out and what was his to carry quietly. He was clear about it, he carried it quietly. But quietly is not the same as easily. The distance started without announcement. He recognized it later as what it was, a pulling back, not hostile but self-protective, the natural motion of someone who is carrying something they don't want to drop on someone else. He worked. He was practical and present and helpful and friendly. He was also, he recognized in honest moments, not entirely there. Something he'd been giving the evenings, the full attention, the open conversation, the being present with her specifically, he was rationing now, and she felt it. He knew she felt it because Wren was not a person who missed much. Her attentiveness to the land extended to people she was near, and she was near him constantly. He caught her looking at him sometimes with that evaluating expression, the one from the first day, but edged now with something that wasn't quite confusion and wasn't quite hurt and was somewhere between the two. She didn't ask. That was her way. She didn't push past where she wasn't invited. But he could feel the question in her silences, a new texture to them that hadn't been there before the storm. The crisis came, as crises on a ranch will, through an animal. Concordia got into a section of old fencing that they hadn't gotten to yet, out in the north corner, and came back to the barn with a deep cut on her left foreleg that needed immediate attention, cleaning, closure, wrapping, monitoring. Eli found her first and went to work, and was halfway through the cleaning when Wren appeared in the barn doorway with the supply kit she'd apparently already assembled, because she'd apparently seen the blood trail and read the situation before he'd finished processing it. They worked together over the horse with the efficiency they'd developed, close and coordinated, and at one point they were both leaning over the same section of wound and their hands almost touched, his steadying the leg, hers working the closure, and she went still for just a moment. "Hold that," she said, indicating where his hand was. He held it. She worked. Her hands were sure and capable, and the wound closed cleanly under them. She taped the wrapping with practiced precision and then straightened, and he straightened, and they were close in the barn the way they'd been close on the night of the colic, the amber light, the smell of the horse and the hay, the specific intimacy of a hard thing done well together. And she looked at him. It was the look from the garden, magnified, the unguarded one, but this time it didn't close quickly. She held it, her gray-green eyes on his, and he could see what was in them, the thing that had been in them for weeks probably that she'd been deciding whether to allow. "You've been different," she said quietly, not an accusation, a statement. He held her gaze because he owed her that. "I know." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding but finding the right shape for something true. "Because I've been carrying something," he said carefully, "and I didn't want it to land on you when he paused. "You're still figuring out what you're standing on. I didn't want to make that harder." She looked at him for a long moment. "What if," she said, her voice very quiet, "figuring out what I'm standing on, some of it involves this?" He didn't answer. He didn't trust himself to answer. "Eli," she said, just his name, plain and direct, the way she said everything that mattered. "I'm not asking you to make it simple. I'm not asking you to be certain about anything for me." She turned the horse's brush over in her hands once, then set it down. She stopped, tried again. "I've been standing at the creek every morning for weeks trying to figure out what I'm feeling. And I think I'm fairly sure that some of what I'm feeling is that you matter to me in a way that's more than the land and the work." She met his eyes. "And I need to know if I'm the only one standing at the creek." The barn was entirely quiet except for Concordia's patient breathing. "You're not," he said. The silence that followed that was not empty. It was one of the fullest silences he'd ever been in, a silence holding everything that had been accumulating for weeks, all the almost moments and banked fires and careful distances, held there now in the amber light between them. She exhaled slowly. Something in her face released, not dissolved into softness. She wasn't built for that kind of dissolution, but eased, like ground that's been waiting for rain. "Okay," she said quietly, "okay." He took a slow breath. "Wren." "I'm still figuring things out," she said. "I want you to know that I can't." She looked down briefly, then back. "I don't know exactly what I'm building yet, but I know that she stopped. "You're the first person who's made me feel like whatever I'm building is valid, like however it comes out. It's allowed to be real." He looked at her strong, careful, extraordinary face, the face that had been doing the work of honesty since the first day she'd stood in that doorway and told him the plain truth of her situation with no apology and no performance. The face he'd been quietly studying for 2 months in stolen moments of unguarded attention. "It's allowed to be real," he said, "whatever it is." And she stepped forward, not impulsively but deliberately, the way she did everything, and she took his hand. Just that. Her hand in his, fingers interlacing in the way of a choice made, the way of something that had been true for a while finally being named. Her hand was work-rough and warm and entirely certain. They stood like that in the amber barn light, her hand in his, and the horse breathed around them. And outside the ranch was going about its evening, and the creek ran its constant conversation with the stones, and neither of them needed to say anything else. November came in on cold, clear air that smelled of distance and impending change, and the ranch became something it hadn't been since before the Mallorys lost it, a working place, a living place, a place with a future. They'd filed the paperwork to formally board Concordia's care, and 2 other horses had been acquired, good young working stock that Wren had scouted with a horseperson's discerning eye, arguing Eli down from one price and up on another with equal conviction. The south pasture was being rested through winter on her recommendation, and the north was being amended with the soil program she designed. The kitchen garden had been put to bed properly, wrapped and mulched, and waiting for spring with the specific patience of things that know they will come back. The evenings were back. Better than back, actually. They were something new, something that had moved past the careful provisional quality of the early weeks into something more honestly inhabited. They sat on the porch in coats now, in the cold, crisp evenings, coffee steaming, and they talked without the same guard up. Not that she'd abandoned her natural reserve. Ren would always be a person who chose her words and valued her private interior, but the reserve had changed quality. It was no longer the reserve of someone protecting themselves from a person who might not be safe. It was the reserve of a person who knew who she was with and was choosing, deliberately and continuously, how much to share. She was sharing more. He could feel the trust in it, the deliberateness of it, and treated it accordingly. One evening she said, unprompted and quietly looking at the stars, "I think I've known about myself since I was about 19. She turned the mug in her hands. I just didn't have words for it that felt right. The categories that existed, she shook her head slightly. They were other people's categories, and I didn't fit them exactly. I kept waiting to fit them exactly before I said anything." "Did you ever fit them exactly?" "No," she said. "I just got tired of waiting and decided the exact fit was less important than the true thing." She looked at him. "You know what I mean." "I know exactly what you mean," he said. She looked at the stars again. "I think this place is where I figured out the true thing," she said. "The quiet of it, the land just being what it is without any performance." A pause. "It taught me something." "What did it teach you?" She was quiet for a long time. The stars did their indifferent, magnificent thing overhead. Somewhere far off, a coyote said something once and was answered and fell silent. "That the thing that's real doesn't need to justify itself," she said finally. "It just needs to be cared for and given room." He looked at her profile against the dark sky, the strong line of it, the particular angle she held her head when she was thinking, the braid that had long since stopped being tidy at the day's end, and he'd long since stopped seeing as anything but exactly right. "We should give the south pasture until March," he said. She turned, startled, and then understood he wasn't changing the subject. He was extending it. He was talking about the land and about this, simultaneously in the way that felt true on Mallory Creek, where the two things had become inseparable. "March," she agreed, "then April might be better." "April," he said, "we'll wait." She looked at him, the long look, the real one, the one that held everything. And then she leaned back in her chair and looked at the sky again, and her hand was on the armrest between them, close to his. He didn't take it, not then, not yet. But his hand was close to hers, and the closeness was deliberate, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. The land stretched out before them in the dark, recovering, resting, waiting for what it would become. The creek ran. The stars turned. Concordia breathed in the barn. Everything that was going to grow was already in the ground. The conversation with Garrett Cole happened on a Tuesday in November, cold and clear, and it was necessary, and Eli did it alone. Cole met him at the property line, their mutual fence in the north, the boundary between Mallory Creek and Cole's grazing land, which was practical enough that neither of them had to pretend it was anything but what it was. Cole was not a stupid man, and he'd assembled what he knew, and he met Eli with his hands in his coat pockets and his easy confidence somewhat reduced. Eli said what needed saying directly, that Wren had built something real at Mallory Creek, that she was not available in the way Cole had been imagining, and that whatever help or consideration Cole believed he was owed had been decided otherwise by the person it concerned. He said it without hostility. He said it with the flat clarity of a man drawing a fence line. This is where it goes. This is why. This is what's on either side. Cole was quiet for a long time, looked at the horizon, said things that were careful and revealed more than he'd probably intended, about what he'd hoped for and what he'd read into the situation and where he'd been wrong. It was uncomfortable for both of them in the particular way that honesty usually is. At the end of it, Cole nodded once, the nod of a man accepting a survey. "She's better where she is," Cole said finally, and there was something in his voice that Eli decided to take as genuine, the particular generosity of a man who knows he's lost, but respects the outcome. "She is," Eli agreed. They shook hands. Neither of them suggested having coffee. He told Wren about it that evening plainly, leaving nothing out. She listened with her arms crossed but her posture looser than it usually was for things involving Cole, and when he finished, she was quiet. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you did." "I did." She looked at him. The look was complicated and warm and something more than either of those things. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You'd have done it yourself," he said, "if you'd wanted to." "Yes." She looked out the window at the cold evening. "I've just been working up to wanting to, a beat. I think maybe I needed someone else to know the full version of what I am before I could say it out loud to someone before I could say it to him." She glanced at Eli. "That doesn't make sense." "It makes complete sense," he said. "You needed to be seen first." The look she gave him then had no reserve in it at all. December. The ranch in December had a particular beauty that neither of them had expected. The way the frost came onto the grass in the mornings, each blade individually silvered, turning the south pasture to something like hammered metal in the early light. The cottonwoods along the creek lost their leaves and stood bare, the bone white of the branches catching the low winter sun. The sky was an extraordinary blue above them, the blue that only exists in high desert in winter, that particular shade that looks like something that should have a more important name than blue. They worked differently in December. The outside work was reduced by cold and short days and the particular dormancy of a resting ranch. They worked inside more repairs to the interior, the planning work, the cataloging and the paperwork and the decisions about what spring would bring. Long evenings by the wood stove. Books and maps and occasional arguments about fencing and planting and the best use of the east slope. Arguments that were increasingly more pleasure than conflict because arguing with Wren was genuinely interesting, and she seemed to feel the same about arguing with him. One evening she was reading one of the thick agricultural volumes, lying on her stomach in front of the wood stove the way she sometimes did when she was deeply into something, and he was at the table working through the spring budget. And the room was warm, and the fire crackled, and the snow they'd gotten that afternoon was making the world outside very quiet. He looked up from his papers and looked at her, and she looked up from her book at the same moment, with the spontaneous synchrony that had developed between them over months of proximity, and they just looked at each other for a moment in the warm wood stove light. She put the book face down, marking her place. "Tell me what you're planning," she said. Not the budget. She meant what she always meant when she asked that question in that specific register. "Tell me what you see here. Tell me what this becomes." He told her. He'd thought about it enough that the words came easily. The livestock expansion, the South Pasture restoration timeline, the possibility of a small kitchen garden operation for the local market when they had surplus, the fencing work for spring. He talked about the land the way she'd taught him to, from the inside out, following its own logic rather than imposing something from outside. She listened with her chin on her folded hands, watching him, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment. "What about the house?" she said. "The second floor needs the roof reinforced." "April," he said, "after the South Pasture prep. The kitchen needs to be rethought. That stove is original to the 1940s. "Agreed." She was quiet again, looked at the fire. "This is a good place," she said, and the word good carried everything she'd put into it over 8 months, all the work and the learning and the morning standing by the creek and the slow determination to make something right from something broken. "It's going to be a genuinely good place." "It's already a good place," he said. She looked at him, and the look was different from all the other looks, the ones he'd been cataloging like he cataloged fence condition and soil quality and water table, the storm gray look, the evaluating look, the unguarded look, the warm flash look. This was something new. This was the look of someone who has arrived somewhere they weren't sure they'd find. She got up from the floor in one easy motion and crossed to the table and sat in the chair next to his, not across, next to, and looked at him from there, close, in the warm winter light. "I want to stay," she said. It was quiet and it was enormous and it was the truest thing she'd said, he thought, in all the true things she'd said. "Then stay," he said. "I'm not asking permission," she said, almost smiling. "No," he agreed, "you never do." She looked at him in the close lamplight, and then she turned her face slightly, just slightly, toward him, and the space between them was very small and charged with everything the months had built. His hand was on the table. Her hand came to cover it, not tentatively. Decisively, the way she did things, the way she planted and fenced and read and moved through the world, with her whole intention. Her hand on his, both of them still, the fire saying its warm thing to the cold outside. "Eli," she said, in the voice she used for things that mattered. "Ren," he said. And the snow outside covered everything equally, and the fire burned clean, and the lamp between them was steady, and neither of them moved for a long time except toward each other, slowly, the way the south pasture moved toward spring, quietly, necessarily, entirely right. The world outside was very still. Inside, something that had been waiting a long time arrived. April brought rain, the right rain, the gentle, persistent kind that the land accepts without drama and turns into green without showing off about it. The south pasture, rested all winter on Wren's instruction, came up with a density and depth of growth that made Eli stand at the fence line in the early April morning and do the rancher's equivalent of a double take, a long, silent, recalibrating stare. Wren stood beside him. "I told you," she said. "You told me," he agreed. "Then you were right." She looked at him sideways, and the sun was new, and the air was cold and clean, and her braid was the same as always, and her boots were already mud-spotted from the morning's work, and she looked, he thought, like the most correct person in any landscape he'd ever been in. "Do you want to know a secret?" she said. "Always," he said. She looked at the green pasture, the impossible green of it after months of frost and dormancy. "I wasn't sure," she said. "About the pasture. I was mostly sure, but not entirely." She glanced at him, something in her expression that was the particular self-aware humor of someone acknowledging their own uncertainty without shame. "I've been watching it every morning since March, thinking, please just come up, please be right." He looked at her. "You were standing at the creek every morning." "Partly the creek," she said. "Partly the pasture, partly," she stopped, looked at the green, "partly just a breath, being glad about things." "Glad about what things?" She turned her head and looked at him fully in the morning light, with nothing managed about her expression at all, open, entirely, in the way she'd learned to be with him and nobody else. "Everything," she said. "I'm glad about everything." He reached over and took her hand, as he'd learned to do, not tentatively, not carefully, but with the same steady certainty she brought to everything, the same quality of intention. Her fingers laced through his with the ease of something practiced. They stood at the fence line in the April morning, looking at the south pasture coming back. The land didn't lie. It never had. Under all the damage and the drought and the years of being misunderstood, the good thing had been there the whole time. It just needed someone willing to wait for it, willing to see it. Mallory Creek. $1. One morning. One woman standing in a doorway with storm-colored eyes and no intention of being less than what she was. Everything. The dollar bill was framed on the wall of the main room. Wren had done it without telling him. One day in late April it was just there, in a simple wooden frame that had been some other thing before she repurposed it, hung on the east wall beside her hand-drawn map of the property. He'd stood and looked at it for a long time when he'd found it, this battered, crumpled dollar in its neat frame, and then he'd looked at the map beside it, with all its careful notations and the single word "wait" in the south pasture. He didn't say anything to her about it immediately. He waited until evening, until they were on the porch in the new mild spring air, with the first real warmth coming back into the world and the south pasture visibly green from where they sat. "The dollar," he said. She said over her coffee. "Why?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the pasture. "Because it's the thing that started it," she said. "And because," she tilted her head slightly, "because it matters. The thing that looks like a foolish choice, the thing everyone laughed at, the thing that didn't make sense to anyone watching." She looked at him. "It was the best dollar ever spent." He looked at the green pasture. "It was," he agreed. She leaned her shoulder against his, not dramatically, just the easy contact of two people who have learned the particular comfort of each other's proximity, the simple, undeniable warmth of being close to someone you trust entirely. The creek ran its patient commentary somewhere in the cottonwoods. Concordia was in the south field. The kitchen garden was 3 weeks from its first harvest. The land, rested and cared for and finally understood, was becoming what it had always been capable of being. And on Mallory Creek in the springlight, two people who had both needed a place that could hold what they actually were sat on the porch and watched what they'd built. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.